What's the most disturbing secret you've discovered about someone close to you? The 24 hours before my dad died, stage 4 lung cancer, he was in the ER and then the ICU and we were unable to be with him because of hospital COVID rules. My mother, sister and myself had been texting and calling him all day and got no response. My mother even called the hospital and spoke with one of his ICU nurses who said he was awake and communicating fine. He passed very quickly at 3:30 a.m. the next morning. We were allowed to be at his bedside but by then he was no longer conscious, so we said our goodbyes and he was gone. Later that morning while my mom slept, I was calling cremation services to schedule his body for pickup at the hospital and going through his bag of belongings the hospital had returned to us. His phone was in there and I wanted to read all our texts and take some comfort in my last words to him. I opened his phone and all our texts had not been read, not mine or my mom and sister's. I thought this was so odd but figured he must have been suffering so much he couldn't find the strength. I began to scroll through his apps and noticed a chat app I'd vaguely heard of. I can't recall the name but it essentially works like WhatsApp. I opened the app and saw a single contact with a female name. I started reading and realized my dad has been chatting with this girl hourly for the last 24 hours and as far back as I could scroll. He was calling her princess and telling her he loved her and she was saying she was scared for him and wanted to know what was going on. Why was he in the ER, etc. I scrolled back enough to know that this was someone he was having at the very least an emotional affair with. My grief was completely hijacked by hurt and anger and a week later I tracked the girl down and spoke to her, via DMs, and found out she was 19 years old. She was 17 when they met. He was her high school bus driver and she told me they had been dating for almost 2 years. My dad was 66 years old when he died and dating someone younger than his grandchildren, someone he chose to spend his last moments with and say his last goodbyes to. I hope it made him happy but it sure is a crappy secret to live the rest of my life with, a secret that will forever overshadow my entire relationship with my dad with no chance to ever speak to him about it. It's the one secret I wish I'd never found out.
My parents found out that my husband is the donor for my lesbian best friend's children and they won't stop trying to ruin our lives. So I met my 2 best friends in college and we have been inseparable since. We all found our significant others in college and ended up living within 20 minutes of each other after graduation. Not too long after that my husband and I had our first child. My friends and their significant others expressed a desire to have their own children. After doing some research about artificial insemination and speaking to a few clinics, they had a lot of doubts about the entire thing. This went on for about a year until they asked me how I would feel about my husband being the donor for their kids. Apparently after a few drinks the subject was brought up and they couldn't really find any cons with the idea. They would for sure know what the father looked like. They would have access to him and his family in case of any medical questions came up. They would be able to know for sure that their kids all had the same donor. And finally the thought that all of our kids would grow up with a bunch of cousins was very exciting for them as they mostly came from very small families. It took some convincing but after some time spent discussing it and speaking with a family lawyer we did it. It has been one of the best choices we've ever made. That was in 2009. There are 10 kids between the 3 families, the oldest being 15 and the 2 youngest being 7. So that is how life was. Didn't really have any issues, mostly just a lot of questions once we told the kids when they got a little older, but essentially we lived as one big happy extended family. Everything seemed to be going well until my parents found out. Something which we were actively trying to keep from happening as both of my parents are very conservative and racist. This has caused a lot of issues as my husband is Mexican and my best friends are very out and proud lesbians. We have multiple times cut off contact with them because of the way they acted or things they have said. Up until 2020 and my dad almost dying from COVID, we hadn't spoken to them since 2012 after my second child was born. His near-death experience and his continued health issues seemed to inspire some growth in them both. Then they somehow found out about my husband being the donor and they went off the deep end. They were convinced that he had somehow brainwashed all of us into this harem where he was defiling these white women, that my friends weren't actually gay and this was all some big conspiracy to commit white genocide. It was very eye-opening, all the hate that spewed out of their mouths when they found out. The extent of the vitriol that they had for my husband made me rethink all of our recent interactions and those interactions with my kids. Any of the growth that seemed to be there after my dad almost died had vanished. If it would have just been that, I would have just never spoke to them and I would have probably regretted not having them in my life but also understood that they couldn't be in my life, but they just kept going. They called the police to have them do wellness checks on us to make sure we weren't under the influence or being coerced. Called my husband's and friend's workplace to tell them about the supposed inappropriate relationship they were having, which caused lots of issues. Then the worst part was that it got around enough that the kids heard the rumors and were getting bullied for it. 6 months of bull crap. 6 months of snide comments and open hostility from my parents and random people I don't even know. 6 months of my kids and my friends' kids getting bullied for things that aren't their fault. We always expected some rough patches from the situation, but never thought it would be enough that we would be contemplating moving schools or even cities. So as I sit here, I can't help but hate my parents, and it bothers me because I don't know how there will ever be a day when I don't hate them. When we had previously gone no contact, I would feel regret and remorse on holidays, wishing that they could be there. But this Sunday on Father's Day, I didn't feel any desire to call my dad.
I hated growing up with gay parents. Right away, I want to make it clear, I'm not a homophobe. My sister is gay, and many of my friends are gay too. In fact, even though I'm straight, having same-sex parents made me more comfortable with people in the LGBTQ+ scene. The reality of my family being different from most others didn't hit me until the 3rd grade when the bullying started. The word spread around the class that I had 2 moms, and before I knew it, I was being taunted for it on the playground. Back then, my relationship with my parents was happy and loving, so I shrugged the remarks off. However, as puberty hit, I became increasingly aware of the absence of a father figure in my life. Although my relationship with my parents was already straining due to other factors, I found myself yearning for a male role model, someone to talk to about guy things. My parents had no male friends, and their conversations about males were usually negative. I would hear that men were inherently violent, selfish, and unhealthy, and I began to believe them. Growing up in such an environment, I developed more feminine tendencies and lacked traditional masculine attitudes. My situation was exacerbated by homeschooling during middle school, leaving me without exposure to how guys my age behaved or looked. I didn't have any contact with male relatives either. Both of my parents had severed ties with their families. When I returned to public school for high school, I found myself intimidated by my straight male peers. Eventually, I learned to talk and dress like them, but I never truly became comfortable around them. To be clear, my parents were extremists, and I acknowledge that. They even refused to let my younger sister attend sleepovers if fathers were present, fearing they might harm her. To this day, I'm still unsure where their anti-male sentiment came from, but they never seemed to acknowledge the impact it might have had on me, a male. Around the age of 12, I began to comprehend more about my conception. My mother conceived me through artificial insemination from an anonymous donor. Lacking a named father has put me in a perpetual existential crisis. I feel as though I was not conceived out of love. I was conceived because my parents could afford to purchase the necessary ingredient. I will never know half of my biology, half of where I come from and why I exist. I feel as though I've been deprived of an experience almost everyone else in the world has. The worst part is, I feel utterly alone in this state of being. Orphans and adoptees are entitled to want to know their biological parents, and they receive support for that desire. Children who have deceased or absent fathers at least have their mother's memory, pictures, and stories, a name, even. I will always have nothing, and never felt supported for wanting more. Whenever I would bring up these feelings to my parents, they would be dismissed as pointless and ungrateful. I was told I was simply fortunate to be born. Over the years, I've tried to make peace with this reality. I've managed to connect with some of my half-siblings on my biological father's side online, who are spread across the United States. They don't have any idea who our biological father is either, but they all grew up with fathers in their homes. I don't think I'll ever find peace knowing my biological dad might be out there somewhere, and my mom doesn't even know what he looks like. I feel entirely alone in this sorrow. I spent my teenage years envying my friends with fathers, wishing that I'd been born into their family instead. As conceited as I know this sounds, I never felt validated as a straight male growing up. My parents wanted a daughter instead, and they got one a few years after me. I felt guilty and wrong for being a boy because there was no one in my family like me, and I was told time and time again that men were the devil. Once I became aware of it, Father's Day became one of the worst days of the year. I'm not trying to say that same-sex individuals shouldn't be parents. I'm only saying that they should be conscious of the impact that it will inevitably have on their children, and that they should try to provide them with role models of their gender. However, I am against anonymous donation clinics. Those anonymous donors are leaving their offspring to be with a question that will haunt them for the rest of their lives.
My husband suggested polyamory a few years ago, and I love it. We're 5 years into our marriage with 3-year-old twin girls. After the girls were born, he pushed for a polygamous relationship, and at first I was against it. He kept pushing, and I finally said yes. At first, when he would be out with someone else, I would cry. I debated divorce for a while. After I cried and processed everything, I realized how over him I was. I also realized that leaving him would put me in an awful position, and the girls would have to live their whole lives moving houses every other weeks. Then while I was deciding what to do, I realized the perks. He works full-time, and I do part-time teaching a few yoga classes in the morning. I get great insurance through his work, a great place to live, and barely pay any bills. He worked from home most of the days, but I convinced him slowly into going into the office after I get home from my morning yoga classes, around 9 a.m. I then pushed him to go out on more dates, and I would do whatever I wanted with the twins. We go out on play dates with my mom friends, we see movies, go to parks, and do anything we want. He's almost always gone at this point on multiple dates with multiple women. I get to pick what I want to watch every night after the girls go to bed. I rarely have to clean up after him because he's gone all the time. I basically get all my bills paid for. I get a free place to live. If I want a night off, I just tell my husband I have a date and he takes care of the girls or takes them to his parents' place. I typically don't have a date. I just go shopping, eat at a place by myself, read a book at Starbucks. I'll even do girls' nights and get us hotel rooms so none of us have to Uber home. I've gone on a couple dates, but honestly, I don't really care to date. Our relationship is basically over, but I enjoy the perks of it now. I left my drunk husband at home and he probably offed himself. It was a good day yesterday. We had plans to go out to get our reserved collector's item things, watch a movie later in the day. It was 3 in the morning when I woke up and he started screaming. He was drunk. I was disappointed, but most of all scared. I'm a smaller female, compared to his taller, bigger, heavier frame. He gets blackout drunk and argumentative when he had much to drink. He scares me when he gets his drunken fits. We've talked about his drinking before. He struck me in the face the last time, had bruises where he grabbed me the last time. I told him, once he was sober, that I would leave for the sake of my safety if such an incident were to occur again. Unfortunately, it happened once more last night, seemingly without any trigger. He was drinking beer, he always did, but promised me he wouldn't go overboard. It's been half a year since the last time, so what happened tonight, I didn't see coming. I was already in bed, asleep when he started screaming, probably enough to wake the entire floor. We live in a condo. I confronted him and he started arguing, challenging me what it is he did this time. He wasn't aware he was shouting. I didn't want to talk and argue with a drunk man, so I start packing. He didn't like it, so he lashed out and pushed me to the floor. I finished packing regardless. In his drunken state, he accidentally locked himself out of our unit. When I opened the main door to leave, he was begging me to stay and talk it out. I wasn't having it. He then pushed me outside and told me to leave. I left. There were some moments where he followed me to the lobby and talked crap at me about how I didn't care for him, that all I wanted was to go live with my parents again. I'm staying with my family to sort myself out and give each other space. He's been texting me, telling me we're done and he's going to off himself. He's always been threatening to off himself. There were several times I had to push or block him out of the balcony with my puny frame so he wouldn't jump. He's a huge man compared to me. I always stayed and did my best for him not to off himself. I always get myself hurt in the process, but this time I left, and he texted me how he's going to do it. He hasn't replied to my messages and calls since. I'm not sure why I'm posting. He's probably gone now, but I'm so burned out and tired and scared to check on him. If he went through with it, how I'll handle seeing his lifeless body, how I'll handle everything after the fact. I'm scared and thinking I probably should have just sucked it up and cowered under the sheets as he screamed and let it all pass.
Today I messed up by getting catfished but still following through with my intentions. I, 19 male, started talking to this girl, 19 female, one night after she messaged me through social media. We began talking about common interests with subtle flirting here and there. The following day I, not knowing what she looked like, asked her to send a photo of herself. She proceeded to send 4 pictures, 2 of which she was in baggy clothing, the other 2 being top angles. All of these photos had 2 things in common, all had filters, and all hid what everything below her neck looked like. After talking for a little while, our conversation shifted to a more intimate context, sparing the whole conversation for discretion reasons. The important part is that we had planned for her to sneak over while my parents were out of my house the next day. Well, the next day rolls around and we talk about her coming over, which she later does. After waiting an hour for her bus to get to my house, I wait outside so she knows which house was mine. Here is where this story goes downhill. As she walks to my driveway, I notice something about her. Not only was she hiding her body, she was also very unattractive in person. To put the cherry on top of the cake, she smelled like a mix of body odor and cigarettes. Me, not wanting to be rude as she had just traveled across town to do the devil's tango, walked her into my house and to my room. We put on a show on Netflix and began following through with what we had previously talked about. After finishing up what was and will be my worst intimate experience ever, we both just sat there. I sat there thinking about how I could get her out of my house without being rude. I finished a glass of water and said I was going to go fill it. I quickly pulled out my phone and bribed my sister, 20 female, to come knock on my door and tell me my parents were home early and that they needed me to help them unload groceries. I told her I was sorry and that I needed to go help. I told her to take the next bus, which was 20 minutes later. To my surprise, my parents did come home early as my mother had suffered an injury hiking, giving me the perfect excuse as to why she had to leave. For the next 2 hours I sat there smelling like her with my family, regretting everything I'd just done. This inspired to go deep clean my room and bathroom to keep my mind off of what happened. As I sit here writing this, 2 questions linger in my mind. Why didn't I just refuse her? And how do I stop feeling this disgust and regret?